The frost on the parlor window had turned the color of old bone, and somewhere behind it, the town of Dunmore Creek went about its evening as though nothing in the Hallett house had ever made a sound. For 4 years it hadn't. Not officially. The blood on the kitchen floor that January night had a strange quality to it. Too dark, almost black under the coal oil lamp, spreading slowly between the cracks in the pine boards, the way water finds its level. Cecily Hallett lay with her cheek pressed against those boards, tasting copper and iron and the faint waxy bitterness of the lye soap she had scrubbed them with that very morning. She was 23 years old, and she had learned through patient and terrible repetition that the fastest way to end an evening like this one was to go very still and very quiet, the way a rabbit freezes in an open field when it hears the shadow of wings overhead. She waited. The boots paced. Glass clinked against the mantel. Dunmore Creek sat in the low country east of Georgian Bay, in Ontario, hemmed in on 3 sides by black spruce and frozen bog, and on the 4th by the Nottawasaga River, which ran gray and indifferent through the winter months. It was a mill town, prosperous enough in the way frontier settlements measure prosperity, in board feet and barrels of salt pork and how many men a single family could put on the payroll. In the winter of 1883, that family was the Halletts. Cecily had been born a Greer. Her father, a timber scaler named Douglas Greer, had carried her to the altar at St. Andrew's Presbyterian on a Tuesday afternoon in February, the ground still iron-hard with frost, and handed her like a promissory note to Edmund Hallett, who was 38 years old and owned the only sawmill on the river. Edmund had stood very straight at that altar. He wore a charcoal frock coat and a gold watch chain, and the women of the town had admired his bearing and his clean-shaved jaw, and Douglas Greer had shaken hands with a man who had just cancelled his debt. Cecily had believed it was love. She was 19, and there is no cruelty in that. She had believed it for perhaps 3 weeks. The first time Edmund hit her, it was over a letter she had written to her cousin in Barrie, a cheerful, inconsequential letter about the winter light on the river. He had found it on the writing desk before she could post it. He had read it slowly, twice, and then he had folded it into a precise rectangle and placed it in his vest pocket and looked at her across the breakfast table with an expression so calm it was almost clinical. "You don't write letters without my knowing what's in them," he said. "You don't send our private life out into the world for people to gossip over." She had started to say that there was nothing private in the letter at all, that she had written only about the light. He put his open hand across her face with a force that drove her sideways off her chair. After that, she learned not to write letters. She learned a great many things. She learned that Edmund's mood could be read in the specific weight of his footstep on the porch stairs. A slow, deliberate tread meant the mill had gone poorly, and she should send away the girl who came to help with the washing. She learned to sleep on her side, to spare her cracked ribs. She learned how to smile at the wives in the church pew, and blame her bruised forearm on the corner of the butter churn, and they would nod, because Dunmore Creek was a town that ran on Edmund Hallett's line of credit, and no one, not even Reverend Thibodeau, was willing to call that debt in. There was a constable, a man named Oswald Reeve, who wore his authority like a coat 2 sizes too large. In the 2nd year of Cecily's marriage, she had walked to his office in March, barefoot on the frozen mud because Edmund had locked away her boots, her dress torn at the shoulder. Reeve had given her tea. He had made a sound with his mouth that might have been sympathy. And then he had driven her home in his cutter and stood on the porch with his hat in his hands while Edmund opened the door, and Reeve had said, in a voice that contained no conviction whatsoever, "Now, Edmund, I trust everything's all right between you two." And Edmund had thanked him and shaken his hand and smiled the way a man smiles at a satisfactory business transaction. That night, Cecily lost the hearing in her left ear for 11 days. By the 4th year, the girl who had sketched cattails along the riverbank and written cheerful letters about light on water had been so thoroughly dismantled that even her inner voice had grown small and apologetic. She ate little. She moved through the house like a tenant afraid to scuff the floors. She had stopped praying for rescue because she had stopped believing the word meant anything. What she prayed for in the dark, with her face turned toward the frost-cracked wall, was simply for it to stop, one way or another. She was not particular about the method. The night the prayer was answered was the worst night of all. Edmund had ridden to Collingwood that afternoon for a meeting about a new government contract, a surveying project that would have opened the North Timber limits to his mill and made him the most powerful man between here and Parry Sound. He returned near midnight. Cecily heard the creak of the stable door and the jingle of the harness and felt the familiar plunge of cold in her stomach. She had learned that the return from a failed meeting was more dangerous than almost anything else. She set down her mending and stood, already arranging her face. Edmund came through the door without removing his coat, snow still on his shoulders. She could see it in his jaw before he spoke, that rigid, terrible blankness that preceded the worst evenings. "Get me something to eat," he said. She turned toward the kitchen. She never reached it. The blow caught her from behind, across the back of the skull, and she went down hard on the pine boards, her vision sheeting white and then black and then resolving into a fractured swimming version of the familiar kitchen. She heard him somewhere above her. She heard the particular sounds, the creak of the settle, the pour of whiskey, the deliberate tread, that had been the soundtrack of 4 years of her life. She tried to rise. Her arms did not cooperate. "Useless," Edmund said, his voice conversational, almost gentle, the way it got when the rage had burned past fury into something colder. 4 years and I have nothing to show for it, no heir, no proper household, a wife who writes letters and embarrasses me in front of men who matter. He reached down and took her by the hair. Through the kitchen window, Cecily could see snow. The river had been frozen solid for a month. Out past the spruce line, the Georgian Bay was a white desert stretching to nothing. The January storm that had been gathering for 3 days had finally arrived, and the wind was tearing through the eaves of the Hallett house with a sound like fabric being ripped lengthwise. She closed her eyes. The storm had come down from the Precambrian shield in the way those storms always come, fast, violent, and entirely indifferent to the affairs of the people below it. By midnight, the main street of Dunmore Creek was buried to the axle hubs, and the single road out of town to the south had fished entirely under 4 feet of wind-packed snow. Coming in along that buried road on foot and dragging a hand sled loaded with winter pelts was a man named August Spear. He was not from Dunmore Creek. He was not from anywhere that could be found on a surveyor's map. Precisely, he had a trapping territory that ranged across 200 square miles of shield country north of the Moon River, and he came to town twice a year, in June and January, to trade his furs at the Hudson's Bay factor and buy his salt, his shot, and his coffee. He was 41 years old and built like something the Shield had assembled from spare materials, wide through the chest and shoulders, with hands that had reset his own broken fingers more than once, and still bore the evidence. His face was weathered to a deep reddish brown, half hidden by a beard the color of ironwood bark, and there was a scar along the left side of his jaw where a beaver trap had sprung closed in his 20s before he'd learned to be more careful. He was not a man who sought the company of towns. He came in, he traded, he bought his supplies, and he left. He had no opinion of other people's arrangements and no interest in civic affairs. But August Spear had spent the better part of 20 years in country where sound carried differently than it did in civilization, where the right kind of cry meant something specific and immediate, and required a specific response. And so, when the sound reached him through the howling of the storm as he passed the large house at the south end of the main street, he stopped. He stood in the snow for a moment. A light was on in the kitchen window. He could see it as a yellow smear through the blizzard. The sound came again, muffled by the walls, and then a heavy concussive thud that had nothing to do with the storm. August looked up and down the street. Lights were burning in the houses on either side, lanterns visible through curtains. Not a soul on the road. No footsteps in the snow leading toward the large house. He stood there one more moment. Then he set down his sled rope, pulled his coat tighter, and walked toward the door. He did not knock. The door of the Hallett house came off one hinge and most of the second when August put his shoulder into it. He had broken through a great deal in his time in the North Country, ice, timber, the carcasses of animals, and he understood leverage. The door swung inward, and the storm came with him, extinguishing the lamp on the hall table and filling the entry with a roar of frozen air. Edmund Hallett spun toward the hallway. He was a substantial man, Edmund, broad-shouldered, accustomed to physical authority. But he had never, in 4 years of terrorizing someone who could not defend herself, encountered something genuinely larger than himself and genuinely uninterested in his name or his bank account or his mill. He straightened, pulling himself up. "What in the hell do you think you're—" August crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. He said nothing. His gray eyes had taken in the woman on the floor, the blood, the angle of her arm, where she'd fallen against the table's edge. He looked at Edmund, the way he looked at things in the bush that presented a threat, quickly, completely, and without ceremony. Edmund reached for the poker that leaned against the hearth. He got his hand around it. August took it from him with one hand, set it aside, and hit Edmund Hallett twice in a methodical and efficient sequence that folded the man completely. The second blow came down on his collarbone, with a crack audible above the wind. Edmund went to the floor and did not immediately rise. He lay there making a sound somewhere between a cough and a moan, his expensive coat spread around him. August turned from him without looking again. He knelt beside Cecily. She had pressed herself against the base of the kitchen table, her arm raised in a reflex she was probably unaware of. Her left eye was swelling shut. There was blood in her hair above her ear. "I'm not going to hurt you," August said. His voice was low and direct. He said it the way he said most things, without flourish, as simple fact. She stared at him. Her raised arm trembled. "Can you tell me where you're hurt?" he said. It took her a moment. "My arm," she managed. I went into the table." He checked it carefully with hands that knew the difference between a sprain and a break. It was fractured, not clean. Behind him, Edmund was making noises that were gradually acquiring language. "She is my wife," Edmund said, his voice still raw, thick with something that was trying to reconstitute itself as authority. "You've broken into my home. I'll have you in front of the magistrate before—" "There isn't a magistrate here," August said without turning around. "And you are not speaking right now." The flat certainty in his voice silenced Edmund more effectively than volume would have. Constable Reeve arrived 12 minutes later. He had seen the light through the broken door from across the street and come with his deputy, a young man named Sutcliffe, who looked genuinely frightened by what he found in the kitchen. Reeve took in the scene, Edmund on the floor, Cecily bleeding against the table, August Spear crouching beside her with his coat wrapped around her shoulders, and his first words were addressed to August. "You're under arrest," Reeve said. His voice did not carry much conviction. A Saul, breaking and entering. "Step away from the woman." August stood slowly. He was a head taller than Reeve and considerably wider, and he looked at the constable with an expression that was not hostile but was entirely without deference. "She has a broken arm," August said, "and she's been like this for 4 years while you collected your wages and looked the other way. That's not something I intend to debate with you tonight." Reeve's jaw worked. He looked at Cecily. In the lamplight, Sutcliffe had relit the hall lamp. The extent of her injuries was impossible to ignore or contextualize or attribute to a butter churn. Reeve had been in this town for 6 years. He had eaten at Edmund Hallett's table. He had taken 4 Christmases' worth of good whiskey and twice been quietly relieved of personal debts. He knew exactly what he was looking at, and he had known it for years, and the knowledge sat in his chest now like a stone dropped in cold water. "Mr. Hallett," Reeves said, and something in his voice was different, thinner, defeated, like a man reading aloud from a page he wishes he could stop reading. "I need you to stay where you are." Edmund stared at him. "Sutcliffe," Reeves said, "help Mrs. Hallett stand." It was not justice. It was not the thing that the moment fully demanded. But it was the first time in 4 years that anyone in Dunmore Creek had said, even implicitly, that Cecily Hallett's pain was a matter that required a response. Reeve would spend the rest of that winter wrestling with what it cost him to have waited so long to give even that much. August Spear did not wait for Reeve to work out his conscience. He lifted Cecily as carefully as he could manage, her broken arm stabilized against his chest, the bear hide coat, traded from a Cree hunter 3 years back, and smelling of wood smoke and spruce gum, wrapped around her small frame. "Where are you taking her?" Reeve asked. "Somewhere she can heal," August said. "Doctor's house first, then somewhere she can heal." He walked out into the storm. The doctor in Dunmore Creek was a man named Pemberton, who had come up from Kingston 20 years ago and never quite worked out how to leave. He was 60, bearded, and possessed of the practical competence of a man who had set bones and treated frostbite and delivered babies in blizzards for 2 decades in isolation from any hospital. He opened his door in his nightshirt, looked at August carrying Cecily on the porch, and stood aside without a word. He set her arm that night. It was a bad 2 minutes, and then it was over, and Cecily did not cry out, only bit down on the folded cloth Pemberton gave her and went the color of birch bark. August sat in the kitchen and drank the coffee Pemberton's wife put in front of him without asking, and when it was done he sat with his hat on the table and said nothing for a long time. "She can stay here," Pemberton said, coming into the kitchen. "Tonight, as long as she needs." "She will need longer than tonight," August said. "I know that." August nodded. He looked at his hands on the table, broad, scarred, calloused to a texture that barely registered cold anymore. He had come to Dunmore Creek to trade pelts. He had expected to sleep on a saloon bench and leave in the morning when the storm broke. "I have a cabin," he said, "north of the Moon River, 40 miles. "Not easy country, no," Pemberton said. "It's honest country," August said. "There's a difference." He left Cecily there that night, and was back at first light with his hand sled and enough provisions to see them across the portages. Pemberton met him at the door with a look on his face that contained both concern and the particular resignation of a man who has understood that the best available option is not the conventionally safe one. Cecily was sitting up in the kitchen. Her arm was splinted. The swelling around her eye had grown and purpled in the night, which was the right direction for it to go. She was wearing a wool dress of Pemberton's wife's, 3 sizes too large, rolled at the sleeves. She looked at August when he came in with an expression that contained no trust. He hadn't earned that yet, but also no fear, which was something. "You don't have to come," August said. "I know," she said. "The town will talk." "The town has always talked," she said. "It didn't help." She stood up. Her legs held. The journey north in January should have broken her. The portage trails were buried, and the ice on the smaller lakes was treacherous, and the cold was of the kind that gets into a person's lungs, like a physical thing, dense and serious. But Cecily Hallett had been enduring serious things for 4 years, and endurance, once learned, has applications beyond its original context. She did not complain. She did not ask how far. She walked when she could walk, and let August pull her on the sled when she could not. And somewhere in the white silence, between the black spruce, with the runners whispering over the crust and the sky a blinding flat white above them, she felt something she had not felt. In so long she did not immediately recognize it. Quiet, not the quiet of a house where you are listening for footsteps. Something else entirely. August's cabin sat against a granite face above a frozen lake that did not appear on any map he'd ever seen. It was 2 rooms, solidly built, with a fieldstone hearth and a drying rack of cedar poles near the ceiling and a sleeping loft reached by a ladder. It smelled of pine tar and wood smoke and the dry, cold smell of stored pemmican. It was the opposite of the Hallett house in every particular that mattered. He set her arm properly a week after the journey, when the swelling had gone down enough to allow it. It hurt considerably. He held her arm with hands that were, for all their size and damage, surprisingly steady, and she felt that steadiness and understood that it was not tenderness exactly. It was something more reliable than tenderness. It was competence extended as care. She had not known that was possible. It reorganized something in her. Over the weeks that followed, she recovered, and as she recovered, she began in small increments to insist on being useful. August did not prevent this. He showed her what she asked to be shown. He showed her how to read the set of a snare, how to know by the compression of snow whether a track was fresh, how to skin and quarter a hare without waste. She learned to carry water from the hole chopped daily in the lake ice and to split cedar kindling with a hatchet, and her hands, which had once poured tea in Edmund Hallett's parlor and been careful of their softness, grew rough and capable and did not trouble her. They talked in the evenings, not immediately and not easily at first. August was not a man who talked easily. He had lived alone long enough that language had become something he treated as a tool rather than an ornament, to be used precisely and put away. But he told her, across time, about the war. He had gone south to Pennsylvania in 1863 with the 22nd Ontario, and come back with a particular and indelible understanding of what men were capable of when authority gave them permission. And about the years in the Shield country afterward, the long, slow process of learning to be somewhere that did not require him to be wary of other people. She listened the way she listened to everything now completely, without interruption. She told him about the letter, about the light on the river. She told him about Reeve and the cutter, and the $23 debt of her father's that had been the beginning of everything. She had never told anyone the full account of it. The telling was strange and difficult, and at the end oddly light, as though the weight of a thing is partly in its silence, and giving it words drains it of some portion of that heaviness. August listened. He did not offer the wrong kind of comfort, which is to say he did not offer comfort at all, only attention, which was what she actually needed. In April, Edmund Hallett came. He had not come alone. He had hired 2 men from Penetanguishene, hard-used men, the kind who did this kind of work, and he had recovered sufficiently from that January night to be motivated by a humiliation that had been festering for months. He had told Constable Reeve, and the magistrate brought up from Barry, that his wife had been taken by force. He had a sympathetic lawyer. He had the mill and the deeds and the social architecture of the county behind him. He also had, now that the ice was breaking up and the portage trails were clear, a route north. Cecily heard the shot before anything else. She was outside at the woodpile. When the sound crossed the lake from the south, sharp and flat and wrong, in the particular way that rifle shots are wrong when you're not expecting them. She had been in the bush long enough, now that she understood sound. She went still. She heard a second shot, closer, and then the particular silence of a forest that has decided to be quiet. She went back into the cabin. August had gone down to check the beaver sets at the south end of the lake that morning. He had his long rifle. But these men had come from the high ground, and she understood from the pattern of the shots that he had not had warning. She did not weep. She did not freeze. She took the second rifle, the short settle gun August had shown her 3 months ago, which lived on the pegs above the door, and she checked the load with hands that moved with more steadiness than she would have imagined possible 6 months before, and she stood to the side of the door, and she waited. Edmund came through the tree line above the cabin. He was breathing hard from the portage. His expensive coat was wrong for this country, too heavy, too restrictive, and his face was blotched red from the cold. He stopped when he saw the cabin. He looked at the empty yard. "Cecily," he called. His voice had its old certainty in it, the voice of a man who had never, in his life, been denied the thing he had decided he wanted. She came out the door with the rifle at her shoulder. Edmund stopped walking. The two men he'd brought stopped behind him. She had practiced at 50 yards through the winter. She was standing at 20. "Cecily," Edmund said, in a different voice now. "Put that down. Put it down and come home. This is madness. You are my wife and I. You are not going to tell me what I am," she said. Her voice was level. She had not known, until she heard it come out of her, how level it had become. Those men have no contract if you're dead," she said. "And I have been shot at before." I didn't flinch then, either. She had not been shot at before, but she held the rifle without trembling. It was the two hired men who made the first calculation. They looked at her stance, the steadiness of the barrel, the complete absence of the thing they had expected to find in a frightened woman alone at a trapper's cabin. And they looked at each other, and one of them took half a step back. From below the tree line, moving fast up the slope with blood on his shoulder and his face rigid with controlled fury, August came through the trees. The two hired men made a full accounting of what they were standing between. The woman with the rifle and the bleeding, expressionless man coming up the hillside. And they made the choice that men make when their professional calculus is no longer adding up. They stepped back. They backed into the trees. They did not return. Edmund stood alone in the clearing. He looked at Cecily. He looked at August. He looked at the rifle. Something left his face. Not a specific emotion, something more structural, like a load-bearing assumption that had quietly given way. He was still a substantial man, still the owner of the Dunmore Creek Mill, still possessed of lawyers and debts owed, and social architecture. None of it had followed him up the Portage Trail. He was standing in April mud in the wrong coat at the end of a 40-mile journey, and the thing he had come to reclaim was looking at him over the sights of a saddle gun without any fear whatsoever. He left. He walked back into the spruce and did not look back, which was the first intelligent decision he had made in years. August sat down on the woodpile when he was gone. He pressed his hand against his shoulder and looked at the blood on his palm and said, with the economy of a man who did not use words he didn't mean, "Good. You're shot," Cecily said. "I've been shot before," he said. "It was worse in Pennsylvania." She looked at him. "Come inside," she said. "Let me look at it." He looked at her, at the rifle still in her hands, at the steadiness in her face that had not been there in January, and that he had watched arrive over the winter, incrementally, the way the light comes back north after the solstice. "You're all right?" he said. "Yes," Cecily said. And then, because she was a person who had learned the difference between a hollow answer and a true one, "Yes, I actually am." Constable Reeve filed a report that spring that listed Edmund Hallett's injuries as consistent with a break-and-enter gone wrong by an unknown party. The magistrate from Barry, reviewing the evidence presented by Pemberton and a statement from Sutcliffe, declined to press charges against August Spear. There were things said about Mrs. Hallett's whereabouts by people in Dunmore Creek, small-town things, the usual currency of places that have nothing else to spend. But the specific tenor of those things shifted over the months that followed, because Reeve had quietly, without fanfare, written a letter to the county office in Barry that detailed 4 years of calls to the Hallett house and his own response to them, and what he had chosen to do and not do, and he had put his name on the bottom of it and filed it where it could be found. It was not the full reckoning the moment deserved, but it was the beginning of one. Edmund Hallett's mill ran for 2 more seasons before a fire of uncertain origin took the main sawhouse in the autumn of 1884. He sold the remaining deeds at a loss and left the county. No one followed his departure with any particular grief. Cecily did not return to Dunmore Creek, and she did not need to. She had no remaining debt to it. She had come into the Shield country with a splinted arm and 4 years of accumulated damage and the barely living ember of herself, and she had, over a single winter, done the work of getting back what had been taken, not quickly, not easily, and not without scars, but completely. The country north of the Moon River is hard country. It is also, for those willing to learn its terms, honest in a way that the world of parlors and promissory notes and tin-starred men looking the other way can never quite manage. In the spring of 1884, August Spear added a second room to the cabin. He did not offer an explanation for this. Cecily did not require one. She understood by then that this was how he spoke when language was insufficient, with effort, with permanence, with the wood and the stone, and the particular kind of faith that builds things meant to last. She picked up a hammer and helped him frame the wall.